As a learning coach for the past nearly 15 years, I'm in a unique position where I've been able to have really in-depth conversations with some of the top performing learners in the world, examining what their habits and tendencies are. What are they doing that makes them so good at learning that other people do not do? And so here are 11 fairly unique habits that you can start incorporating too to become a more efficient learner. And by the way, I probably have never seen someone who does all 11 of these habits and is not a top performing learner. And so starting with number one, top 1% learners generate before they consume. In learning science, the word generate means to produce information yourself. So if I asked you, what do you think are 11 habits of top performing learners, and you guessed a list of 11 habits that you think maybe are right, you would be generating that list. So making predictions, creating analogies, answering questions, trying to explain something in your own words, these are all forms of generation. It is an active process that involves working with what you already know and often extending or extrapolating on that knowledge. When you generate during learning, it primes your brain to learn new information faster. But most people do not actively generate before they consume. They start with reading through the textbook, watching the video, just taking information in. And as a result, it takes longer to understand new material, the retention is often lower or takes more repetition, and there's a higher chance for the brain to be more passive in that learning. In my experience, the reason people don't generate before they consume is twofold. The first thing is that they don't realize how important it is, and the second is that generating takes active effort, which also takes more time, and when you're already busy or you've got lots to cover, it often gets skipped. Now, there are lots of different types of things that you can generate, but one of the most useful things to generate is habit number two. High-performing learners almost always have a mental model. In simple terms, a mental model is your own representation of how something works. When you're learning a new topic, especially one that's complex, there are two things that you don't know. Number one, you don't know the actual stuff, the content. You don't understand the concepts, the keywords, the terminology. The second thing is you don't understand how all of that stuff connects together in a cohesive picture. You may understand each concept individually, but you don't know how they influence each other. This is important to apply that knowledge. It's very rare that you apply information in isolation. And so a mental model is your brain's schematic for how all those things actually connect together. The very best learners make it a priority to develop this mental model as early as possible. Often they will guess a mental model fully knowing that it's wrong just to correct themselves later. They generate a predicted mental model, and that acts as a hypothesis. So when they learn new information, their hypothesis becomes more accurate over time. One of the most common mistakes I see learners making is they try and build a mental model very late in their learning. So they've consumed all the information first, and now they have this trove of concepts and facts, and then they try to put it all together. That can be very overwhelming, and it's a lot for your brain to try and hold on to. Often by that point, you've already forgotten the relevance of some of those earlier facts and concepts anyway, and then you have to go back and relearn it. So all of that is just wasting time, and ultimately that means that your ability to understand and retain really complex concepts is much slower than the more efficient learners who build that mental model up front. Again, just like generating in general, actively trying to build a model of how things fit together at a big picture is something that requires you to take a step back, sometimes pause your consumption of new information. It takes active effort, and for all of those reasons is commonly skipped when learners don't realize how important that is, since it takes more time. And speaking of taking time, we have habit number three, which is to elaborate, not repeat. Elaborating means that you take a concept or a perspective or a fact and you build on it. You add more detail. You think about the connections and the influences with other things. It involves asking questions and going a little bit out of scope sometimes to learn a little bit more. Top learners realize how important that is for building strong, deep memory, whereas less effective learners just try to optimize for pure speed. And often what that means is taking the faster option. They just take the same sentence, the same paragraph, and just repeat it multiple times. A fancy version of this is sometimes they'll just take this, put it onto a flashcard, and repeat it later. But cognitively, the process of repetition is very different from the process of elaboration. Elaboration is a very multifactorial process that engages many different parts of the brain. It's a critical process for building that mental model, and building a mental model is a critical process for what's called memory consolidation. Memory consolidation is literally the cognitive process where new information is encoded into your long-term memory storage. Just repeating things does not trigger those cognitive processes. Now, it is technically possible to shunt that information into your long-term storage with pure repetition, but that pathway is not only much more repetitive, but also much more tedious and time-consuming. And so less efficient learners are often plagued with this enormous body of information that they have technically covered, but is rapidly being forgotten from their brain, and then they are constantly having to relearn it. Compare this with a more efficient learner who spends the time up front to elaborate and build these models, and that saves them time in the long run. Now, a great way of doing elaboration is something that's called spontaneous self-explanation. And this is actually habit number 4. Top learners constantly self-explain. Self-explaining is exactly what it sounds like. It's when you encounter new information, and then after you feel like you've understood that information, you explain it to yourself. Usually from memory is better. You explain what it means, why it's important, how it may connect to and influence other things that you've learned. You try and teach it on the spot. And a characteristic that's been seen in the research and that I've seen in my own practice is that top learners spontaneously self-explain, which means that they undergo this process of self-explanation without being cued, without being prompted, without anyone telling them to. For every new thing that they're learning, they are constantly going through this process of self-explaining. People who tend to self-explain are often more curious, they have more questions about what they're learning, they feel more engaged, and their attention on something that they've just learned for the first time is often much higher. Now that is one way of elaborating, self-explanation. Another way of elaborating is through analogies, and this is habit number 6. The best learners create analogies with limits. We all know what an analogy is, but what most people don't know is that not all analogies are created equal. I like to think of this as there being 2 different tiers of analogy. The first tier is just creating some kind of analogy for the new thing that you've learned. This is already really beneficial. It's an engaged, active process in the brain where you're comparing and contrasting ideas, you're actively working from and pulling from your prior knowledge. So all of these things help to create a good model and build that schema. This helps with that memory consolidation, putting things in our long-term memory. But the issue is that most of the time, analogies are not going to be a perfect representation of this new thing that we've learned. For example, if I say that learning is like filling a bucket with water and forgetting is like having holes in the bucket. Efficient learners focus on reducing the size of the hole, whereas inefficient learners focus on just scooping water and filling the bucket again. This analogy works in the sense that it highlights how efficient learners have a different approach where they're reducing how fast they forget things, but it also simplifies learning in some ways. There are many other factors and variables that influence how good or bad someone is at learning, which doesn't really fit into this bucket with a hole analogy. And so every analogy has its limits. And this is the second tier of analogy. This is even more beneficial. It's when you create an analogy and then evaluate how good that analogy is. A good analogy has fewer limits to it, and then the limitations it does have should be explicitly acknowledged. Creating what you think is the best, most accurate analogy with limitations forces a much deeper level of evaluation in your brain. And that deeper evaluation involves deeper, more effective cognitive processes, which result in deeper, stronger memory formation. Now, these first sets of habits are really focused on what learners tend to do when they first encounter new information, how they set themselves up for success by building stronger memory. There are another set of habits which are around how they test their knowledge and increase their fluency. In fact, really great learners are very aware of where their knowledge gaps might be, and they're constantly proactively trying to fill those. And so a bonus habit, which is technically not part of the list, that I've seen thousands of learners do, is that they will deliberately expose themselves to new insights and perspectives that they haven't encountered before by joining my free weekly newsletter. This is a weekly email that I write up myself and send to you straight to your inbox for free, where I think to myself, what are the most valuable insights and perspectives that I think could be a total game changer, that I think would help someone to learn faster and think more clearly and manage their time and tasks better. The stuff that I've learned from almost 15 years of coaching people and experimenting on myself personally. And so if you yourself are a proactive, motivated person that wants to learn faster and think sharper, then you might also be interested in joining this newsletter. So if you are, I'll leave a link in the description for you to learn more and check it out. But let's move on to the next habit, which is how top learners test their knowledge. The top 1% test themselves before they're ready. Testing your knowledge is not unique in and of itself. What is unique is deliberately testing your knowledge before you feel like you're going to do well in that test. Now, neuroscientifically, there are a lot of reasons why testing yourself earlier on is beneficial. There are many beneficial cognitive processes that are stimulated from just early testing. But one of the big advantages is that it's just much more time efficient for figuring out your gaps. Think about it like this. When you're learning something new, you don't know where your gaps are. You know you have gaps, but you don't know what you don't know. And it's really difficult and time consuming to try and think of every possible gap or error in knowledge that you have across everything that you've learned. What is much faster is just to test yourself and see where the gaps are. Instead of looking for landmines by carefully sweeping every step that you take, you just sprint through the field and look back to see what exploded. Except when you make a mistake by testing your knowledge, you don't die. And on a related note, related to testing your knowledge, not related to dying, top learners actively disconfirm themselves. Disconfirming means looking for reasons why you are wrong. When you learn something and you're building these models of how you think everything works, you are forming little conclusions here and there. But the chances are that, especially for something complex, some or many of those conclusions are going to be wrong. So actively trying to look for reasons that you're wrong. What are the counter arguments? What are the other schools of thought? This is a huge time save overall, especially when you're learning about a wide domain. So for example, I remember in my first couple years of learning about learning science, I went down this particular branch of the research in learning psychology and started formulating all these theories around how I thought learning works. It's only like 1.5 to 2 years into this that I realized that there was actually a whole counter school of thought that argued against what I'd been learning. And it exposed me to an entire way of thinking about the topic that I just hadn't been exposed to before. Now, there's no good reason that should have taken me over a year. I would have discovered that other school of thought in minutes if I had just thought to look for it up front. And I see this tendency all the time with busy, especially working professionals who are just trying to learn something to get a job done. And so they learn something, they arrive at a conclusion, they put it into practice, but they don't take the extra little time just to disconfirm the conclusions that they've made. And that sometimes costs them months of wasted time and effort going down the wrong direction. And it's probably for this reason that the best learners have habit number 8, which is they have less conclusions and more questions. When you do not understand how something works and you're trying to learn it for the first time, you're full of confusion and you impatiently want to get to an answer. But often that lack of patience can cause you to arrive at an answer that is incorrect or incomplete. And if we just arrive at that first answer, say this is how it works, we lock that in as a conclusion, then that becomes an error that gets carried through the rest of our learning. It's like building a house on shaky foundations. Eventually it's going to come crumbling down and it's going to be more costly and time consuming to repair because everything else is built on top of it. And so more experienced learners are more comfortable with leaving things unknown. They don't have to arrive at a definitive answer or a conclusion, but if they didn't arrive at a conclusion, then they leave it as an explicit question. For some of my clients, I actually encourage them to leave a list of open questions as they're learning about a topic. And the benefit of being okay with having uncertainty and leaving a list of questions is that it not only prevents errors from being carried forward, but it also stimulates your brain to think in the right way very quickly. Those lists of questions become a really targeted area for your brain to focus on. And so next time when you come back to learn this, you're not sort of just opening up a chapter of a book and mindlessly starting to read. You're starting with these questions and looking for those answers more purposefully. And that focus helps your brain to process information faster. All right, habit number 9. Top learners distinguish familiar from understood. When something is familiar, it means that your brain recognizes that it's something it's encountered before. When something is understood, it means that you've built a mental model around it, you've elaborated, you've self-explained, you've created analogies with limits. You can really work with that knowledge, and it's probably stored very strongly in your long-term memory. It's formed part of your knowledge. And there's a very big difference between being able to recognize something as familiar and actually having it properly understood and encoded. The issue is that both of these states feel very similar to a learner. Many learners will take something that they've covered before, maybe a couple days later, they'll open it up again and they'll skim through to see if they remember it all. And their signal for checking if they have remembered and understood it is that it feels pretty comfortable. They look through it and they go, yeah, oh yeah, I remember covering this. Yep, I think I know all of that stuff. This all still makes sense to me. Those are all recognition signals that only tests your familiarity. And it's the reason why many of the learners that do that, later when they need to reproduce and generate that knowledge from memory without any cue or any aid, especially if they have to apply their knowledge at a higher, more complex level, will fail. An experienced learner has probably failed in that way enough times to realize that those familiarity signals, those recognition signals, are not reliable. And so the way that they test their knowledge does not involve recognition at all. They will test their knowledge purely from memory, without cue, without aid. Their source of truth is whether they were able to generate the necessary knowledge in those conditions. And if they were not able to, that indicates a gap or a weakness in the memory, even if they look over the material again and think, oh yeah, yes, no, I do remember that. I just made a silly mistake. They don't accept that. Now on to the next habit, which I think is actually maybe one of the most hallmark signs of a really top learner, which is that they have a high sensitivity to boredom. Here's something that maybe you didn't know. When your brain is not learning effectively, it feels bored. Boredom is a literal symptom of ineffective learning. What this means is that if your brain is engaging in effective learning, it doesn't feel bored. This is deeply hardwired into the biology of the human brain. Now, caveat, there are other pathways of learning that your brain has access to that can still be activated while feeling bored, but those pathways are all much less effective, much more time consuming than the ones we really want to be using. And so top learners realize this, and they know that when they're reading through something and their eyes start glazing over, they're starting to feel sleepy and bored, that is a signal that their brain has entered into a passive state and they're no longer learning effectively. So what they do is, instead of just powering through that, like shotting a Red Bull, they will pause, they will recalibrate, increase their engagement by using a more active learning strategy, and they reapply themselves to the material using boredom as a diagnostic signal. Now, many of the habits I've already talked to you about in the video so far are strategies that you can apply that help to make your brain more active and stave off boredom. But I'll give you one more strategy, which is the 11th habit of top learners, which is they ask questions they can't answer. Something I've observed consistently over the years is that less effective learners tend to enjoy answering questions confidently. So sometimes they deliberately test themselves in ways where they know they're more confident. Now, when I explain it this way, the problem is obvious, right? Where if you're only testing yourself in the way that you know you're going to succeed, you're not revealing the gaps in your knowledge. And this is exactly true. This is what happens. On the other hand, top learners, they deliberately look for where they're going to be wrong. So they test themselves by asking questions that they know they don't have a good answer to. And so continually asking difficult questions about what you're learning keeps their brain active and engaged and in this constant problem-solving mode. There's always a new challenge for your brain to figure out, and trying to solve those challenges drives that learning at a deeper level. So those are 11 habits that you can start using yourself. Like I said, I've really never seen someone that does all 11 of these habits and is not a very effective learner. And if you're wondering how these habits fit into your existing system of learning and what you need to do next time you sit down and study something, then you may want to check out this video here where I break down the way that I think about a learning system. This is the way that I coach my students and my clients. And so if you don't really have a learning system, then this video is a great place to start. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.